In this lesson, at least in the beginning, we're going to continue to talk about the fact that Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. It's one of the most well-known stories in the Bible. And the reason it's so well-known, I believe, is because it's so intriguing. Nothing like this has ever occurred in the Bible, and it really makes us wonder what happened and why. And of course, God doesn't give us as much information as we think we're entitled to. And like other similar situations, this has led to some pretty unusual human conclusions about the whats and the whys. Anyways, down through the centuries, some have reported coming across this pillar in their travels throughout the region. There are numerous legends associated with it. For example, when a piece of this human-shaped statue or pillar becomes misshapen by age or by breaking off, something like that, miraculously, the broken piece, the worn piece, is repaired. Others have said that when birds have consumed some of the salt, before long, whatever was lost would be mysteriously restored. As I said, imaginations tend to run wild when God decides to limit the information he gives us regarding these amazing stories. By the way, when God puts a limit on any information, he does so for at least two reasons, in my opinion. Number one, he doesn't owe us any explanations. And number two, when how isn't important, how isn't provided. You see, sometimes how is not only not unnecessary, but it can be distracting and risky. The way God does things is almost always far above our intellects, and including us in on the method and mode can challenge us cerebrally and cause unintended harm. In other words, if God did always give us the how, we'd likely not understand and end up with even more wild speculation than we already have. Now, you know what? Let's go back and read the section we're studying just so we can preserve the context. And this won't take very long. This is only a few verses, starting at Genesis 19:23. We are in the midst of the 19th chapter of Genesis. I'm going to read out of the King James. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Verse 25. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, the way this is written, we can and must assume that Lot's wife is trailing behind the rest of the fleeing party. Now, the reason that is important is because it communicates to us her tepid commitment to escaping the wicked city. The picture is being drawn of someone who's escaping against her wishes. She doesn't want to leave, and it shows. We can see that she is terminally attached to that sinful town. In fact, I would guess that neither Lot nor his wife were all that thrilled about leaving a place they had grown fond of, but clearly Lot's wife was even less convinced of the propriety of fleeing the coming destruction than Lot himself was. It seems almost impossible to believe, but Mrs. Lot didn't appreciate the fact that God himself singled her out for protection. Clearly, she didn't deserve God's attention, but his grace was offered for her protection. Mrs. Lot didn't want to leave, and it cost her her life. Either she didn't see the depth of the depravity of her neighbors, or she didn't care. As I muse on what's happened in this story, I find myself playing the role of Mr. Judgy Pants, and I'm a bit ashamed of myself for it. I mean, there's a lot of this that hits uncomfortably close to home, doesn't it? The English reformer John Bradford, upon watching criminals being sent away for prosecution, uttered an immortal phrase that sticks with me every time I catch myself getting a little critical of others. He said, "But for the grace of God go I." When I stop and think about how many times God has had to grab me and drag me to safety to convince me that I need to be rescued, that I need to flee the bad situation I've put myself in, and how ungrateful I've been, well, I'm sorry, Mrs. Lot's wife. I should keep my mouth shut. But that doesn't mean I can't pick out the lessons from this that we all need to learn. Never forget, there's nothing in the Bible that's here just as entertainment. Everything must be examined for the lesson God intended when he put it there. Genesis 19:26, but his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Tony Bennett may have left his heart in San Francisco, but Mrs. Lot left hers in Sodom, and she wasn't ready to leave it there. That feels like a really cheesy youth pastor thing to say, but it doesn't make it any less accurate. And I think we need to look at this story because it's still relevant to us today. In fact, there are churches, entire denominations actually, that are jam-packed with salt pillars. And how does one become a salt pillar? By refusing to leave worldliness behind, refusing to separate from the world of sin, becoming so intertwined with this world that you feel it's a part of you and you're a part of it. I mean, the church today has a salt intake problem. This story calls for a little preaching. You know, almost every one of our little regulars group has once been a part of some very big, let's call them Christian institutions. And by the way, I find that the most committed lovers of Christ are the ones who've made the cold, hard decision to ditch religion altogether. Well, let me point out that God told Lot and his family, don't look back. Now, God didn't say why they were not to look back, did he? But do you think anyone was confused about that order? Did anyone in that family ask God for the specific reason they weren't to look back? No, not that we know of. There's nothing in the record, but come on, they knew. I mean, after that appalling spectacle that crowd of men put on that night, do you really think they were still unaware of what God was doing there? Listen to this closely. This family was in need of a rescue. It took them a while to figure that out, but they finally did. The problem is they didn't appear to like the terms of that rescue. But again, let's not tisk too loudly. This happens to go right to the core of the corruption of the human heart. In fact, an honest Christian cowers in shame every time this event is discussed. You see, the world and its pleasures are always calling to us. Even the most dedicated servant of God hears that call. We know Jesus heard it because the Bible tells us that he suffered all the same temptations that you and I do. In fact, he had it worse than the rest of us do. The devil himself showed up to make that call to Jesus. Every temptation that Satan threw at him in that desert was an enticement to follow the flesh, satisfy the belly, satisfy the ego, trade suffering for comfort no matter what the cost. The draw of the flesh is very powerful. The draw of the world is very powerful. It promises us pleasure. It promises lots of friends. And sorry, fellow Christians, there's a lot more of them than there are of us. It's always been that way, and it always will be. The world promises to accept you as long as you reject God and play by their rules. And even though at this moment you feel, steadfast and unmovable in your dedication to the ways of God, the world is never going to stop trying to wear you down. And for some, it works. The world gets in. It lodges itself deep down and grips us like nothing else can. They can't hear God's warnings over the call of sin, or they don't want to. They've become entangled in what the world has talked them into, and to let all that go seems unthinkable. And you know what? They may actually agree that they need a rescue. They see the danger. They see God's point. They know that this is wrong, but they still can't let go. Does any of this sound familiar? Lot's wife couldn't let go even while the place burned. It would appear that her heart would never leave that place, even if that place no longer existed. But again, let's not just keep pointing the finger at Mrs. Lot as if she's somehow unique in this respect. In fact, I believe her brief appearance in the record is there as a warning, actually as a reminder. Over and over in the Bible, we hear this very same thing. The rich young ruler who wouldn't relinquish his treasures even to follow the Lord of life, the one he bowed down and worshiped. The newly liberated Jews who complained that they missed the flesh pots of Egypt, even though they knew they came with the shackles of slavery. And who could forget those Gadarenes who politely asked Jesus to leave because he rudely rescued them from a legion of demons? You remember that story, don't you? Jesus shows up on the south shore of Galilee. He's confronted by a possessed man who had been menacing the community for some time. And then our Lord commences to cleanse the man by sending a whole gaggle of devils into a herd of domesticated pigs. These weren't wild pigs, they were farmed pigs. The pigs, who were smarter than their herders, decided they'd rather die than be tainted by evil, destroyed themselves by running off a cliff into the sea. Smart pigs. And in return for that good deed, the citizens ran Jesus out of town. It seems odd, doesn't it? Well, not when you take a closer look at what was going on there. He once again sees inside humans that they prefer their flesh over their salvation. In their minds, Jesus didn't rescue them, he ruined them. They figure, what's a few minions of darkness compared to the lucrative pork business? Let me pause here and make sure I remind you, never mess with Jesus. Never think you're smarter than he is. Never think you can hide anything from him. You see, It was no mistake that Jesus sent those demons into that pig herd. Those pig farmers, the ones in charge of those herds, were Jews. The Gadarenes are from the tribe of Gad. The tribe of Gad is one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they were pig farmers, Jewish pig farmers. They were openly, brazenly, and unapologetically breaking God's law. Not only did Jesus rescue the Gadarenes from those demons, he rescued them from themselves. But of course, they didn't like that, did they? Matthew 8:34, and behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they besought him that he would depart out of their coasts. Thanks, but no thanks. Just like Lot's wife, the Gadarenes didn't want to be rescued. No wonder the Bible isn't very popular. Actually, maybe that's not altogether accurate. There are parts of the Bible that people will tolerate. They like the "be kind to me, I'm a stranger" thing. Not exactly a direct quote, but that's how it'll get quoted. They love that Jesus was a friend of sinners, but they don't like that he takes people's pork from them just because it's a little sign of disobedience. What's a little disobedience here and there? They'll tell you that Jesus forgave that woman caught in adultery, but they forgot that he told that woman to sin no more. All right, sidetrack over. Let's get back to Genesis 19. Starting at 23 again. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And then we have this abrupt scene change. In an instant, we are transported back to Hebron. Verse 27, and Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, and he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in the which Lot dwelt. This is such an incredible moment that I'm actually concerned I'm not going to do it justice as we go over it. But I'll do my best and let God do the rest. So I pondered this little section for quite a while. For one thing, the imagery it invokes is frightening. Abraham is 40 miles distance and almost 4,000 feet up on a mountain from this scene of devastation. The way the original is written, we once again get the sense that Abraham is watching the ground burn. The ground itself is on fire. The King James says the smoke of the country went up, but a better translation is the smoke of the earth went up. Now, given what we talked about already, it's likely this meant that those tar pits or maybe some other sources of oil so plentiful nearby on the surface ignited and burned all night. Now, the other thing that crossed my mind as I read this over and over is, why did Abraham go back to that spot where he stood before the Lord? Obviously, that means the place where he wrestled with God over God's plans for that wicked place. This is where Abraham urgently pleaded with God for the righteous few who might be in those cities, or so a surface reading of that record leads us to believe. But we think we figured that out. More on that in a second. Let's talk about a couple of other things first. What I want to know is why. Why did Abraham rise early and go to that spot? Here we go with the why questions again. Look, curiosity infers interest, and I want you to find this interesting. I mean, if you're having a conversation with your best friend and he's telling you an important story from his day, what kind of jerk would you be if you didn't seem interested? Wanting the details means it matters. This story matters to me, first of all, because my father is telling it to me, and secondly, because I know there's a lesson in here for me, because there's always a lesson in all my father's stories, and I don't want to miss it or get it wrong. And the best way to be certain I don't make mistakes is to make sure I get as many answers as are available for me to get. So I work on this thing until I feel I've pressed out all the information I can. That's how we approach every verse. So back to my why question. Why did Abraham go over to that same spot? I mean, the Bible makes a point to tell us he did so. Doesn't that mean there must be some significance to it? Some of the experts say no, it was just a matter of curiosity. Even at that great distance, the destruction was so destructive that surely Abraham heard it. He may have even stayed up listening to it, and he only ventured out at first light to assess the damage. Of course, he knew what all the noise was about. God had told him what he was going to do. Then some say Abraham was just wondering how God dealt with his prayers. Maybe he didn't hear all the ruckus going on down in the valley, so he rose early, as the King James puts it. All he was doing was checking on the outcome of the bargain he struck with God. Well, I wonder if the reason Abraham walked over to that spot was because God told him to do so. Remember, the whole point of including Abraham in on the plan was so that Abraham would pass on to his descendants the ways of Jehovah, as it says here. Maybe God wanted to show Abraham that for God, his justice is of paramount importance to him with respect to mankind. No price tag is too big to preserve his justice. God wanted Abraham to see that God will not be mocked. Because if Abraham sees that, he's going to pass it on. Genesis 19:27, and Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, and he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain. Now, some enemy of God, some critic might ask, well, why didn't Abraham turn into a pillar of salt? He looked over at Sodom and Gomorrah. Why didn't Abraham get the same treatment that Lot's wife did? Well, the answer is simple, and I think it's an important thing to keep in mind when reading your Bible. God didn't punish Abraham because he's not a robot. He's a living, dynamic being. Listen, we will never be able to hold God hostage with the things he says. We tend to think that God puts himself in a box. We think, aha, that's it. I know how God is going to act in every situation. He did this with this situation, so he'll do that with every other. Well, for one thing, the command was not to not look, it was to not look back. And besides, and this is the important part, the command wasn't to Abraham. It was to Lot and his family. This was more than some blanket prohibition on looking at the destruction God was bringing. That wasn't the point. The point was God telling the prone to double-mindedness family to leave their mistake behind forever and don't let your heart return to it. Lot and crew, you've been given mercy. You are being rescued from your poor decision-making. Be thankful and do not take this rescue lightly. Do not regret nor reject the blessing of grace. You and I have a lot to learn from this, don't we? We've been saved. God has snatched us from the fire. Let's not drift back. That's the message here. This is a warning against backsliding. God didn't turn Abraham to salt because God is a thinking, aware, conscious, free will being. He's not a totem pole. He's not a cold, uncaring stone idol. He is alive, and he is going to assess every situation on its own merit. You know why? Because he's fair. He's just. In that moment, this had nothing to do with Abraham. Why would God act against him? Why would God use an inapplicable judgment against an innocent man? We tend to forget that God is just. He knows when and where to apply his judgments. I mean, his record is clear. He wants justice, not condemnation, as Peter, the friend of Jesus, put it, 2 Peter 3:9, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. John, why are we going through this? Because God is real, and he is a person, and you're in a personal relationship with him, and I want you to realize it. You've been saved by a person. He's alive right now, thinking about you and the things you're going through, and he is making decisions for your life based on you. When you pray to him, he's listening. When you're singing Amazing Grace, he hears you and he reacts to the sincerity or lack thereof in your heart. I'm not making this up. This is from the Bible. I'm not trying to give you a pep talk. This is what the Bible tells you. God isn't a formula, looking at Sodom equals destruction. Why is Abraham looking at Sodom in this moment? What is in Abraham's heart? What motivated Abraham to seek the results of his pleadings for his nephew? These are just a few of the things that God evaluated when he decided not to turn the man into a pillar of salt. It's called judgment. We tend to think of that word as simply meaning punishment. That's not it at all. To judge something is to weigh the facts and then react to those facts accordingly. All right, let's get back to Genesis 19. I keep wavering off. No wonder this lesson is so long. I want to finish this scene with Abraham, though. Verse 27, and Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord. And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the earth went up as the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of that plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in the which Lot dwelt. First of all, we finally have the answer to the question we asked in the last chapter. Of course, you remember how much time we took asking that question. Why was Abraham going to such risky lengths to ask God to be merciful to the righteous down in Sodom? Well, God tells us that in the midst of all this destruction, he remembered Abraham and spared Lot. Clearly, but perhaps not explicitly, God is letting us know the true motivation behind Abraham's importunity. Abraham was concerned for his nephew Lot. Of course, God knew that all along, and he decided to honor his friend's request. God saved Lot because Abraham asked him to. God remembered Abraham and spared Lot. I mean, this is a lesson I really need to learn. I mean, sometimes when I go to pray, I think, oh my God, God is never going to honor a request like this. I'm a fool to expect God to do this or that. And so I'll just not pray for certain things because I think, well, the thing is impossible. Why bother asking for it? I'm pretty sure Abraham didn't think Lot was all that righteous, but he took the chance and asked God to spare him anyhow. And look what happened. God spared Lot. Do not, John Tomasi, let your own trepidations limit what you think God is willing to do. We all know he can do anything, but we sometimes don't think he'll do everything. And it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in the which Lot dwelt. This next item up for discussion is perhaps one of the most interesting and demonstrates the intentional nature of the things God puts in the record. And it also demonstrates how important it is to study the original languages, because when we do, the power of these things God says stand out. In this case, if we didn't go back to the Hebrew, we'd miss out on the tone of this passage. In the English, we read that God destroyed the cities and God remembered Abraham. That alone is fairly ominous, but nothing compared to the original. God sent a message that still resonates and still has relevance to us today, and we need to read that whole message. The word in the original isn't God. It's Elohim. Now, to the ancients, the name Elohim is synonymous with terrifying power. It was Elohim, the terribly powerful God, that destroyed these cities. Of course, you remember Elohim is also the name God used when he told us how he created everything. Elohim is the creator and Elohim is the destroyer. The very same magnitude of power. Remember, Elohim is actually a plural word. All that multiplied power that put together and keeps together our universe, that very same powerful Elohim is the one who overthrew the wickedness of those cities. And by the way, the word overthrew or overthrow is a better translation than destroyed. Other words could be spoiled or utterly wasted. The word choice is meant to terrify the reader, including the name God uses for himself. All of these words were carefully chosen to frighten. The mighty Elohim gathered in and focused all of his power to rain down judgment on sin. That's the message we're to get. Elohim, the powerful God, overthrew the wickedness of those cities. And he made it look easy. God's goal, Elohim's goal, fear. I've told you before, God didn't need all the lightning and the fire to get done what had to get done. He did that for you. He brought all of that destructive force together, the loudness and the heat and the destruction, so you got the message that God judges sin. I mean, Elohim effortlessly made everything we see and experience right now in 6 days. Do you think he needs to bring lightning and ignite petroleum pits and burn the very ground to get done what he intended to get done? Of course not. Everything we read in this passage, listen to me, was meant to strike fear into the hearts of men, all men. The ones experiencing it, all the way down to us who are reading it today. This was not a Jehovah moment. It was an Elohim moment. I mean, Jehovah's very name infers a God who is helping his people, and he uses that name over and over in the Bible when the situation fits. A gentle, loving, thoughtful, merciful name. Moses, the author of this passage, I can actually see in my mind Moses crossing out the tetragrammaton on the scroll, and he's replacing it with the name Elohim. This is not a Jehovah thing. This is an Elohim thing. Jehovah was not present in the Jordan Valley that day, I can tell you. It was none other than Elohim. Surely Lot didn't think he was dealing with Jehovah at that moment. I promise you, when he eventually went back looking for his wife, by the way, I guarantee you he didn't know what happened to her until he went back the next day or whenever it was safe. Neither he nor his daughters saw what happened because Lot's wife was behind them. They didn't dare look back to see what was going on. They just kept running and looking forward. How do you know that, John? Because they're still alive. But I am sure they went back to find her, and when they did, they knew that pillar wasn't the work of Jehovah. Elohim had been there. Elohim was responsible, and they became even more terrified. I don't like this talk, John. I mean, the God I know doesn't use fear and intimidation to get his point across. Well, good luck with that. But this Elohim is the only God in the Bible. So if your God doesn't have Elohim moments from time to time, he's not going to be in charge much longer. I know the Elohim of the Bible will never relinquish his Elohim side. And frankly, that makes me feel safe. I mean, let me ask you, who would you rather have on your side in a bar fight? Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or Rowan "The Bean" Atkinson? No need to answer. Verse 29, and it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in the which Lot dwelt. Not everyone agrees with me, but I think this verse proves Abraham's true motivation for challenging God, and it proves that God is kind. He is Elohim to those that disobey, and he's Jehovah for those he loves. For Abraham's sake, he saved Lot. Abraham was concerned for his family. God saw through the subterfuge. The man nonetheless turned to God for help, and God delivered, even though he didn't have to. God made a bargain. He promised to spare the place if he found the right number of righteous. He didn't. so he did what his justice demanded, but he also took the time to ease a troubled dear one. I mean, all of God's satanic critics don't want you to read this verse, or at least the latter half of it. They want you to see the big, scary Elohim being a big bully to those poor, unfortunate rapists down there in Sodom. But then they won't let you read that in the midst of this frightening judgment, God remembered the humble cries of a worried uncle, a guy he happens to like very much. God, while unleashing his wrath on the wicked, spread his love on the faithful. What side do you want to be on? Because that's what he does every single day. I honestly hope you see the beauty of this moment. Please see the beauty in this moment and savor it, because the rest of this chapter is decidedly ugly. And unfortunately, that's what we'll be covering next time. See you then.